Talking about jollof rice, Nigeria's food inflation pressures remain deeply rooted in structural and climate-related challenges, and that's according to the latest SBM Intelligence Jollof Index. The Q2 2026 report shows that heavy rains, flooding, poor road infrastructure, and rising transport costs continue to disrupt food supply chains, driving sharp increases in the prices of key staples such as tomatoes, peppers, yam, and plantain. While households increasingly resort to cheaper substitutes and smaller portions, the report warns that Nigeria's food system lacks the resilience to withstand recurring climate shocks, leaving consumers vulnerable to persistent food price volatility. Ikemesit Effiong, managing partner, SBM Intelligence, joins me for more on this. Thank you so much. Well, we call it Jollof Index. The report doesn't sound so interesting as the name is. But let's begin with how much it costs to make a pot of jollof compared to, what we've had before now and what that sort of means.
Yeah, so right now the cost of preparing a pot of jollof rice
with chicken or turkey?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things we did with this report was that we adjusted the basket somewhat, right? So we added a few items, substituted a few items, just to account for the fact that Nigerians are doing that as well. So the cost right now is at a little under 30,000 naira, right, for a family of 5, which is the MBS statistical number, right, for the size of the average Nigerian family. Now, as context, when we started doing this 10 years ago, this year, right, in 2016, that cost was at a little over 4,000 naira. I think it was about 4,037 naira. So that's a 624% increase, right, over 10 years. And that basically just tells the story of Nigeria's macroeconomic performance over the past decade, right? Significant double-digit inflation, right? Climate risk and insecurity, right? Generally speaking, the instability until recently, right, in the national currency, and the fact that Nigerian agriculture is still largely practiced at a subsistence level. So a lot of innovation and a lot of technology has not percolated through, right, in order to make a significant dent, right, in prices. And so, right, in that sense, we think the Jollof Index basically just sums up the story of Nigeria's economic performance, basically in one index.
I like what you said, and then from your report, you sort of outlined certain things. You talked about supply chain issues, currency instability, and lack of agricultural resilience. And then you sort of strongly talked about climate change. Talk to us about that. Let's begin with climate change. How much of an issue is it, and how significant is it when you compare it to the other issues that sort of bedevil Nigeria's food sector? Yeah,
so climate change from a food security standpoint, right, is less a key leading indicator and more like a false multiplier, right? So in a situation where infrastructure, especially in food growing areas, and that farm to market supply chain is dislocated because there are lots of checkpoints, the road infrastructure isn't good, we move a lot of food right via our roads, so there aren't a lot of alternative, there isn't a lot of alternative transport infrastructure to get food to market. When you layer climate change on top of that, right, weather risk, flood risk, washed out roads, the impact on post-harvest loss, the fact that our cold chain infrastructure is not significantly developed, right? So a lot of what we are eventually able to grow, we lose in that post-harvest storage and transportation segments, because climate change just makes that, right, a lot harder. You have a situation where even with all of our other structural issues, if we took out the climate picture, we'll probably maybe see 100 to a 200, 300 naira difference in the headline, right, cost of preparing a pot of jollof rice. But climate change just accelerates those other fundamental weaknesses in Nigeria's food supply ecosystem.
I like what you said about, the cold chain and all of those things, how that it's not well developed. Whose responsibility is it to get it developed?
It's a bit of a yin and yang. I mean, obviously, from our perspective, the private sector should obviously lead on that, but the private sector will only invest in that with strong, right, government incentives, not only in terms of tax breaks, but in terms of providing the supporting physical, right, infrastructure. What's the point of, for example, setting up a warehouse or setting up a cold chain store if the mode of entry and the mode of exit out of that place is still significantly impacted. If for 4 or 5 months of a year during the wet season, it's significantly challenging for an operator to get trucks, to get those sort of supply infrastructure in and out of those facilities. I know that there's some work has gone right in terms of the initial reforms, especially around power, around infrastructure provision and all of that, but it would be good to see more. And also, it would also help if there's a clear and deliberate government strategy around enhancing food resilience and the supply chain infrastructure that undergirds Nigeria's food production, because private sector players would only follow those incentives, right, to define viable areas in the country to invest, viable segments, right, of the industry within to invest. One of the things that we've seen, for example, with the Jollof Index is the astronomical rise in tomatoes and pepper, which require their own specialized storage and transportation, right, infrastructure. Is
that going to change anytime soon? Because
we all know this.
I went through it. Let me just put it that way. And I'm still going through it. Is tomato price going to come down anytime soon?
So it's a bit interesting, right? Because it's like over the past decade of preparing the Jollof Index, we have seen, that repeated volatility and instability, particularly in tomato and pepper prices. Usually in the dry seasons, those prices come down. Again, speaking about climate change, climate being a key part, right, in that, because they are uniquely perishable items, right? They need a lot more care, a lot more investment, which makes it a lot more expensive for them to be harvested, stored, and transported, right? Which in Nigeria is relatively difficult to do during the wet season, which is why their prices have, surprise, surprise, gone up, right, during this time of the year. And you also see a situation where sellers, right, where market behavior is also shaping prices in this sense, where sellers anticipatorily expect, right, that their supply chain resilience, particularly for tomatoes and pepper, would be weakened during the wet season, and they increase prices preemptively, and they aggressively hold on to inventory, right, in order to lock in those profits to account for, the fact that they expect supply to be challenged during this time of the year.
All right, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. I was speaking with Ikemesit Effiong, Managing Partner, SBM Intelligence.